Hello and welcome back to another video in this Java tutorial series. In this video we're going to be discussing something called whitespace and how Java interprets it, as well as best practices when naming variables. Alright, so getting right into it, the first thing I want to discuss here is whitespace. So if I type out that thing that we learned about last time, the system.out.println, and I put a string in here, hello world. What we expect this to do, just print out the word hello world down here in our terminal, and that it does exactly that. Um, but there's this other concept of something called whitespace, and what this is all of like the spaces and tabs in your program that kind of help with readability. So you'll notice here that I can actually like highlight the spaces that I put in my program, or I can also highlight the tabs, which just turn into spaces. Um, but what this is the white space. And so what Java does with white space is it actually just completely ignores it. If I have just a bunch of extra statements in here and I run the program again, or not statements, but just like empty space here, you'll notice that I actually get the same outputs as I did before. And that's because what Java does here is it takes our program and it removes all of the white space when it goes to turn this into like machine code, something that our computer can understand. And the way it does this is through the use of semicolons. Semicolons, like I said in the last video, are basically like a way, it's the English equivalent of a period, and so it tells Java, hey, this is the end of my statement, whatever comes next is something completely different. And so because of this use of semicolons, we're able to separate code as much as we want, and Java has no problem removing all that white space and figuring out what's what and how to differentiate it. An example of the power of this is that I can put like a bunch of white. I can even add white space within our statements, and as long as I don't edit the keywords like system out and like println, I the output of the program will actually remain the same. And this is really helpful in making your code much more readable. But there is something to be slightly careful of when adding this to your projects, and that's that adding spaces to strings does change the output because what we learned about in the last lesson was that strings store all of the data that is between these two quotation marks. So if I add a bunch of space here within my statement, I am adding more spaces to the information that gets stored in that string there. So if I run it, you'll now notice that that space is added in there. So it's something to be very careful of is don't add space to your strings here. And technically something you can do is something called a multi-line string, which I'll show you real quick, where if you do three of these, if you do three strings, and then I get rid of that, like that, then the spacing doesn't matter after that. But then you can do like multi-line strings here, and that is a way of expanding it. You'll notice that this actually does preserve spacing, but that is also still because this is just a multi-line string, and you use three quotations for this. But everywhere outside of strings is pretty much fine. The other thing to be careful of is with print statements here, or with keywords. If I just put in the word string there again, or just a placeholder, you have to be careful with keywords because it's like in the English language. If you have the word the and you place a space in between the T and the H, you have the letter T and the word he, and it completely changes the meaning. It's the same thing in Java. If I had a space here, it changes the meaning of what this statement means to Java because now it's system.out.prin and then another word that says TLN, and Java doesn't know what to do with that. But you can add spaces all around strings, all around your keywords. You can even add it after the semicolon, and Java will ultimately still run this the exact same way by removing all of that white space there. Alright, so the other thing that I wanted to discuss in this tutorial is this idea of like best practices when naming variables. So in the first lesson we talked about how to store information in variables. Like if I create a string and I name it, or I just call it name. The label of our container that stores a string is name, and then I store a string inside of that container, and we'll just go with my own name, which is just Isaac. Uh, there Something you want to be careful of when you're working with your projects is being careful with how you name these variables. The first thing is there is a common way of naming things, at least in how you capitalize words. So if you'll notice in the last video, I didn't like specifically talk about it, but the way you label variables in Java is through this convention called camel case, and all it means is that the first word of your variable name is all lowercase, and then the first letter of your any words that come after it will then be capitalized. So my my name is Isaac. So that could be a variable name, and this follows camel case because the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and then every word that comes after it is capitalized. So that is the convention for naming variables, at least for capitalization when you have multiple words put into a single variable name. The other convention is that, well, it's not really convention, but it's a best practice, and what you want to be what you want to do with your variables or your variable names is you want them to be not too general but not too specific. You want to find kind of this in between. And right here is a case of me being too specific. This string is labeled my name is Isaac, and it stores the string Isaac. But this string has an accurate name. It does, or if I change it to this stores the name Isaac, the name is accurate, but it's not very convenient, and it can kind of lead to problems down the line. So say I wanted to change at some point in my program I wanted to change the name of or change the value that's stored in our container here, and I change it to say Sarah. Um, well, this name still works exactly as intended, but now that the data inside of it has changed, it is no longer accurate, and this variable becomes not only useless in the context of the rest of your program, but it would actually lead to errors in the case that, say, you had something that was checking the name stored inside your string containers or your string variables. Um, and it's expecting the name Isaac, and it doesn't see the name Isaac, and so now your program crashes. Uh, so because this name was too specific, when I wanted to change the behavior later on, this name no longer fit with what I wanted to do. So you want it to be you don't want it to be too specific, but there's also a danger in it being too general. So if I were just to name it like variable one, I mean, as long as I use variable one later in the rest of my program, this would technically work. But now, because you are being way too general and not specific enough with what information your names are storing, it is going to be really hard to read through this code and figure out, oh hey, what is when I add more words to this string later on, what was the information even stored in there originally, and I'd have to keep track of that inside of my head, and this name variable one would tell me no helpful information about what was stored in here at some point. And so the ideal variable name in this case would just be name, and maybe it would be like uh, person's name if you had like multiple name variables, but just specific enough where it describes what's stored in there, but not too specific where if the information changes sometime at a later point where it no longer becomes accurate to what it's storing, but not too general so that you don't know what it's supposed to do. There's this nice balance in between of the of being able to portray what this is supposed to do. And it's something you'll actually realize is kind of hard at some point when you have a lot of variables in the same place that all kind of do similar things. You've got to be very careful about your naming convention. And we'll talk more about this at some point later on in some of these tutorials. But I just wanted to kind of give you an introduction into that. That along with this idea of white space, because you might see me occasionally separate stuff out like line by line where it won't affect how the program runs, but it just makes code more readable. But that's the end of this episode. Just to recap, we talked about whitespace, how Java interprets it, and how it can be used to help make your code more readable, as well as best practices for naming variables with capitalization, as well as just choosing the right name to represent the data stored in that container. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. I'll try to answer it as fast as possible, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.